The dust swirled across the empty street as Grace Nichols struggled against the iron grip of two burly men dragging her toward a weather-beaten wagon. Her heart pounded against her ribs like a wild Mustang trying to break free from its corral. But her strength was failing against their determination to claim what they believed was rightfully theirs. Sweetwater, Wyoming Territory, 1878, a place where fortunes were made and lives were broken with equal measure of indifference. Grace had arrived only 3 weeks prior with dreams of establishing herself as a schoolteacher. The daughter of a Boston banker, she'd been raised with privilege but harbored a spirit for adventure and independence that scandalized her family. When her parents had arranged a marriage to settle her father's debts, Grace had fled west with what little money she could gather. "Get in the wagon, woman," growled the taller man, his breath reeking of whiskey and tobacco. "Your daddy sold you fair and square to pay what he owed Mr. Harrington. We got the papers right here." Grace twisted her wrist, wincing at the pain. "I am not property, you cannot do this." Her voice cracked with desperation as her heeled boots dug furrows into the dirt street. The shorter man, with a scar cutting across his cheek like a dried riverbed, laughed cruelly. "Ain't up to you, miss. Mr. Harrington paid good money for a wife and he's tired of waiting." Behind her, Grace could hear the curious murmurs of townsfolk who had gathered to witness the spectacle, yet no one stepped forward to help. Women averted their eyes, men shuffled uncomfortably, and children were hurried away by protective mothers. In Sweetwater, folks minded their own business, especially when it involved Harvey Harrington, the cattle baron who owned half the county. "Please," Grace pleaded, looking frantically around at the faces that refused to meet her gaze. Her pale blue dress, once neat and proper, was now stained with dust and torn at the hem. Her honey blonde hair had fallen from its pins, cascading around her face in wild disarray. "I am a free woman. I never agreed to any arrangement." "Your daddy did the agreeing for you," the scarred man said, giving her another rough shove toward the wagon where a driver sat impassively holding the reins of 2 bay horses. They had nearly reached the wagon when the unmistakable sound of spurs jingling broke through the tense silence. The crowd parted, and a tall figure strode forward with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to facing danger. "Seems to me the lady isn't interested in your travel arrangements," came a deep voice, calm yet edged with steel. Grace turned her head to see a cowboy standing a few paces away. The sun silhouetted him, casting his face in shadow beneath the brim of his hat, but she could make out broad shoulders and the glint of a star pinned to his vest. "This ain't your concern, Sheriff Reed," the taller man spat, though his grip on Grace's arm loosened slightly. Sheriff Samuel Reed took another step forward, pushing back his hat to reveal piercing blue eyes set in a sun-weathered face. A thin scar traced his jawline, and several days' worth of stubble darkened his cheeks. "When you're manhandling a woman on my street, it becomes my concern right quick, Dobbs." "We got papers," insisted the scarred man, reaching into his vest with his free hand. "She's been sold to Mr. Harrington, legal and binding." Sheriff Reed's hand casually rested on the holstered Colt at his hip. "In Wyoming Territory, we don't recognize ownership of human beings, regardless of what paper you might be carrying. Now, let the lady go." The tension stretched between them like an overwound clock spring. Grace held her breath, sensing she was witnessing a test of wills that could erupt into violence at any moment. "Harrington won't like this," Dobbs warned, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "Harrington doesn't make the law in Sweetwater," Reed replied evenly. "I do." After another moment of hesitation, the men released Grace's arms. She stumbled forward, nearly falling, when Sheriff Reed stepped closer and caught her elbow, steadying her with a gentle but firm grip. "You all right, miss?" he asked quietly, his attention fully on her despite keeping the men in his peripheral vision. "Yes," Grace managed, though her voice trembled. "Thank you." The scarred man produced a folded document from his vest. "This here says Nichols sold his daughter to settle a debt of $2,000. It's got his signature right there." Sheriff Reed extended his hand. "Let me see that." While keeping one hand protectively near Grace, he examined the document. His expression remained neutral, but Grace could see a muscle working in his jaw. "This paper isn't worth the ink it's printed with," he finally said. "A father can't sell his daughter, not here, not anywhere in the United States. The war settled that question 13 years ago." "Harrington's lawyer says different," argued Dobbs. "Then his lawyer can come talk to me," Reed replied, folding the paper and slipping it into his own pocket. "In the meantime, Miss Nichols stays in Sweetwater under my protection." The scarred man's hand drifted toward his holster, and Sheriff Reed's eyes hardened. "I wouldn't, Wilson," he warned quietly. "Not unless you fancy spending the night in my jail or the cemetery." The threat hung in the air for a long moment before Wilson reluctantly dropped his hand. "This ain't over," he muttered. "For today it is," Reed replied. "Now get on that wagon and ride back to Harrington. Tell him if he has a legitimate grievance, he can come to town himself and we'll discuss it proper-like." With venomous glares, the men climbed onto the wagon. The driver flicked the reins, and the vehicle rolled away in a cloud of dust, leaving Grace trembling beside the sheriff. "Thank you," she whispered again, suddenly aware of how close she stood to the tall lawman. His presence radiated a calm strength that made her feel safer than she had since leaving Boston. Sheriff Reed nodded, finally removing his hand from her elbow. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay, Miss Nichols?" Grace thought of her small room above the Mercantile, paid up for another week. "Yes, but if they come back, they won't trouble you again tonight," he assured her. "But tomorrow we should talk about this situation. Harrington isn't a man who gives up easily." Only then did Grace notice the crowd still watching them. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment at being the center of such a spectacle. Sheriff Reed seemed to sense her discomfort. "Folks, show's over," he called out. "Miss Nichols has had enough excitement for one day." As the townspeople dispersed, murmuring among themselves, Reed offered his arm. "May I escort you back to your lodgings?" Grace hesitated only briefly before placing her hand on his arm. "That would be most kind, Sheriff." They walked in silence for several paces before Grace found her voice again. "Is it true that paper has no legal standing?" Sheriff Reed's expression darkened. "No decent court would enforce it, but Harrington has influence with the territorial judge. Men like him think their money entitles them to whatever or whoever they want." "My father," Grace began, then stopped, the betrayal still too raw to articulate. "Some men make desperate choices," Reed said quietly, "but that doesn't make you responsible for his debts." When they reached the Mercantile, Reed tipped his hat. "I'll keep an eye on things tonight. Come by my office tomorrow morning and we'll figure out what to do about Harrington." Grace nodded, suddenly reluctant to part from the sheriff's reassuring presence. "I don't know how to thank you." A hint of a smile touched his lips, softening the hard lines of his face. "Just being able to thwart Harrington is thanks enough, Miss Nichols." As she watched him walk away, his spurs jingling with each measured step, Grace felt a curious mixture of fear and hope stirring within her. In a single moment, her situation in Sweetwater had become both more perilous and more promising than she could have imagined. The following morning dawned clear and bright, but Grace had barely slept. Every creak of the building, every distant sound had jolted her awake, her mind conjuring images of Harrington's men returning to claim her. She dressed carefully in her best blue skirt and white shirtwaist, attempting to restore some dignity after yesterday's humiliation. The sheriff's office was a simple wooden structure adjacent to the jailhouse. Grace hesitated at the door, smoothing her skirt nervously before knocking. "Come in," called Reed's deep voice. Inside, the office was surprisingly neat. A large desk dominated the space, flanked by filing cabinets and a gun rack. Maps of the Wyoming territory adorned one wall, while wanted posters decorated another. Sheriff Reed stood as she entered, removing his hat. "Miss Nichols," he greeted her, gesturing to a chair. "Please sit down." Grace perched on the edge of the offered seat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "Have you heard anything from Mr. Harrington?" "Not yet," Reed replied, settling back into his chair. "But he'll make his move soon enough." "What should I do?" Grace asked, hating how helpless she sounded. Reed studied her thoughtfully. "First, tell me the truth about this arrangement with your father." Grace swallowed hard. "My father's bank in Boston failed 6 months ago." He lost everything: our home, his reputation, even my mother's family heirlooms. I knew things were desperate, but I never imagined he would." Her voice faltered. "Sell you to cover his debts," Reed finished grimly. "Yes." Grace blinked back tears. "I overheard him discussing it with my mother. They were going to send me west to marry Mr. Harrington, a business associate I'd never even met. So I took what little money I had saved and fled before they could force me. And you came to Sweetwater." "It seemed far enough away," Grace admitted. "I had training as a teacher and hoped to find employment here." Reed nodded slowly. "Harrington must have traced your journey. He's not a man who likes to lose what he considers his property." "What can I do?" Grace asked again, more urgently. "Legally, you're in the right," Reed assured her. "But Harrington has ways of getting what he wants without the law. My advice would be to leave Sweetwater." Grace's heart sank. "And go where? I have barely $10 to my name." Reed leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. "I have a friend who owns a ranch about 20 miles north of here. Eliza Blackwood is a widow who runs the place on her own. She's been looking for a school teacher for her ranch hand's children. It would be safe there, at least until we can resolve this situation." Hope flickered in Grace's chest. "Do you really think she would hire me?" "I'll write you a letter of introduction," Reed said, already reaching for paper and pen. As he wrote, Grace studied him more carefully than she had dared to before. The sheriff was older than she'd first thought, perhaps in his early 30s. His hair was dark brown with hints of premature gray at the temples, and a network of fine lines radiated from the corners of his eyes, evidence of years squinting against the western sun. There was a quiet competence about him that she found reassuring. Reed finished the letter, folded it, and sealed it with a drop of wax. "The ranch is called Willow Creek. I'd escort you there myself, but I can't leave town with Harrington's men likely to return." "How will I get there?" Grace asked. "The morning stage passes through here at noon," Reed replied. "It can drop you at the crossroads near Willow Creek. I'll draw you a map for the last few miles." As he sketched out directions, the office door burst open without warning. A young deputy stood in the doorway, breathing hard. "Sheriff, Harrington's just rode into town with a dozen men." "They're headed this way?" Reed was on his feet instantly. "Miss Nichols, go through the back door. My horse is saddled behind the jail. Take him and ride north along the creek bed. It's marked on the map. Don't stop until you reach Willow Creek Ranch." Grace stood, clutching the letter and map. "But what about you?" "I'll handle Harrington," Reed said firmly. "Go now, quickly." Heart pounding, Grace hurried through the back door. Reed's horse was indeed waiting, a magnificent bay gelding that eyed her warily as she approached. It had been years since she'd ridden and never astride, but she had no choice. Gathering her skirts, she managed to pull herself into the saddle just as shouting erupted from the direction of the sheriff's office. With a silent prayer, Grace urged the horse forward, heading north as instructed. Behind her, Sweetwater grew smaller, and the sounds of confrontation faded into the vast Wyoming landscape. The creek bed provided good cover as Grace followed it northward. Reed's horse, while spirited, was well trained and responded easily to her guidance. As the afternoon wore on, the sun beat down mercilessly, and Grace's city upbringing had not prepared her for the rigors of such travel. Her hands were blistered from the reins, her legs ached from the unaccustomed position, and thirst clawed at her throat. When she spotted a stand of cottonwoods ahead, Grace guided the horse toward them. The shade was a blessed relief, and she dismounted carefully, her legs nearly buckling beneath her. A small spring bubbled up among the trees, and both she and the horse drank gratefully. As she rested, worry for Sheriff Reed gnawed at her. Harrington had arrived with a dozen men, dangerous odds even for a skilled lawman. What if they had harmed him? The thought sent a sharp pang through her chest, surprising in its intensity. Grace consulted the map again. According to Reed's directions, she was still several miles from Willow Creek Ranch. With reluctance, she mounted again and continued her journey. The landscape gradually changed as she rode, the flat plains giving way to rolling hills dotted with pine and aspen. Late afternoon shadows stretched across the land when Grace finally spotted a cluster of buildings nestled in a verdant valley. A wooden sign confirmed she had reached Willow Creek Ranch. As she approached, a woman emerged from the main house, shading her eyes against the setting sun. She was tall and lean, with graying hair pulled back in a practical braid. "Can I help you, miss?" the woman called out. Grace reined in the horse. "Mrs. Blackwood, I'm Grace Nichols. Sheriff Reed sent me." Her voice sounded hoarse and exhausted even to her own ears. The woman's expression shifted from wariness to concern. "Samuel Reed's horse, but not Samuel Reed. What's happened?" Grace dismounted awkwardly, her legs nearly giving way. "Mr. Harrington came to town with his men. The sheriff told me to flee while he confronted them." Eliza Blackwood's mouth tightened into a grim line. "Harvey Harrington, I might have known." She stepped forward to take the horse's reins. "Come inside, Miss Nichols. You look ready to drop." The ranch house was surprisingly spacious and comfortable, with polished wooden floors and sturdy furniture. Mrs. Blackwood settled Grace in a chair at the kitchen table and poured her a cup of hot coffee before reading Sheriff Reed's letter. "So you're a teacher," she said finally, folding the letter. "Yes," Grace confirmed. "I was hoping to establish a school in Sweetwater, but circumstances have changed." Mrs. Blackwood nodded thoughtfully. "I have 8 children on this ranch who need schooling. The bunkhouse has a room we've set aside for that purpose, but we've had no teacher. You'd be most welcome to stay and teach them." Relief flooded through Grace. "Thank you, I promise I won't be a burden." "Not a burden," Mrs. Blackwood corrected. "You'll earn your keep, but first you need rest. I'll show you to a room where you can clean up before supper." As Grace followed her hostess down a hallway, she couldn't help asking, "Do you think Sheriff Reed will be all right?" Mrs. Blackwood glanced back with knowing eyes. "Sam Reed is the most capable man I know. He's faced worse than Harvey Harrington and lived to tell the tale." The words provided little comfort as Grace sank onto the bed in the small but neat guest room. Exhaustion claimed her almost immediately, and her last conscious thought was of the sheriff's blue eyes, steady and reassuring in the face of danger. 3 days passed with no word from Sweetwater. Grace began teaching the ranch children, a diverse group ranging from 6 to 14 years old, using books from Mrs. Blackwood's modest library. The work was rewarding, helping to distract her from constant worry about Sheriff Reed and the threat of Harrington's men finding her. On the 4th morning, Grace was in the makeshift schoolroom when she heard horses approaching. Heart racing, she moved to the window, fearing Harrington had tracked her down. Instead, she saw Sheriff Reed dismounting in the ranch yard, speaking with Mrs. Blackwood, who had come out to greet him. Relief made her dizzy for a moment. He was alive and apparently unharmed. Grace hurriedly dismissed the children for an early lunch break and stepped outside, shielding her eyes against the bright sunlight. Mrs. Blackwood spotted her and gestured her over. "Look who's come calling, Miss Nichols," she said with a smile. Sheriff Reed turned, and Grace was startled by the intensity of her reaction to seeing him again. He had removed his hat, and his dark hair was ruffled by the wind. A faint bruise shadowed his left cheekbone, but otherwise he appeared well. "Sheriff," she greeted him, suddenly conscious of her simple dress and hair tied back with a ribbon. "I'm relieved to see you unharmed." "Mostly unharmed," he corrected with a slight smile. "Harrington and his men gave us some trouble, but my deputies and I managed to persuade them that taking you by force wasn't worth the price they'd pay." "Then it's over?" Grace asked, hopefully. Reed's expression sobered. "Not entirely. Harrington's returned to his ranch for now, but he's filed a complaint with the territorial court, claiming your father's debt gives him a claim on you." Grace's stomach knotted with dread. "Can he win such a case?" "Not if I have anything to say about it," Reed assured her. "I've telegraphed a lawyer friend in Cheyenne who specializes in such matters. He believes we can prove the arrangement was made under duress and has no legal standing." "That's welcome news," Mrs. Blackwood interjected. "Why don't you both come inside? I've just made a fresh pot of coffee, and you can discuss the details in comfort." Over coffee and Mrs. Blackwood's apple pie, Sheriff Reed explained the situation more fully. "Harrington's influence isn't what it once was. He's overextended himself buying up land, and the recent drought has hit his herds hard. That's probably why he's so determined to collect on your father's debt. He needs the money." "I have no money to give him," Grace said ruefully. "It's not about the money anymore," Reed replied, his voice hardening. It's about his pride. You've defied him, and so have I. Men like Harrington can't abide that." "What should I do?" Grace asked. "Stay here for now," Reed advised. "Mrs. Blackwood's ranch is well outside Harrington's usual territory, and her hands are loyal. You'll be safe while we sort this out legally." Mrs. Blackwood nodded in agreement. "Miss Nichols has already proven herself valuable. The children are learning more in a few days with her than they did all last winter with just me trying to teach them between ranch chores." Reed smiled at Grace. "I'm not surprised. You strike me as a capable woman." The compliment brought unexpected warmth to Grace's cheeks. "Thank you. I'm grateful for this opportunity." After finishing his coffee, Reed rose to leave. "I should get back to town. The lawyer from Cheyenne will be arriving tomorrow, and we need to prepare our case." Grace walked with him to where his horse waited. The midday sun highlighted the silver strands in his hair and the lines etched around his eyes, evidence of a life lived outdoors in harsh conditions. "Sheriff," she said hesitantly, "I never properly thanked you for what you did. You risked your life to protect a stranger." Reed adjusted his saddle, not meeting her eyes. "It's my job to uphold the law and protect those who need it. Still, many men might have looked the other way, especially against someone as powerful as Mr. Harrington." He finally turned to her, his expression serious. "Miss Nichols, some things are worth standing for, regardless of the cost. Your freedom is one of them." The simple conviction in his voice touched her deeply. "Please be careful," she said. "Mr. Harrington seems like a dangerous enemy to make." A ghost of a smile touched Reed's lips. "I've been sheriff in Sweetwater for 8 years. I've made plenty of dangerous enemies along the way." He mounted his horse with easy grace. "I'll return when I have news about the case." Grace watched him ride away, the sense of safety his presence provided diminishing with each hoof beat. Only when he disappeared from view did she realize she had been holding her breath. The next 2 weeks settled into a comfortable routine. Grace taught the children each weekday, assisted Mrs. Blackwood with household tasks, and gradually learned about life on a Wyoming ranch. The ranch hands a diverse group of men who clearly respected their employer, were initially shy around the Boston lady, but warmed to her as she showed genuine interest in their work. Sheriff Reed visited twice during this time, bringing news of the legal proceedings. The lawyer from Cheyenne had filed a petition with the territorial court declaring the agreement between Nichols and Harvey Harrington null and void. A hearing was scheduled for the following month. On his second visit, Reed brought a letter that had arrived for Grace. With trembling hands, she opened it to find her mother's familiar handwriting. "My dearest Grace," it began, "word has reached us of your situation in Wyoming. Your father is devastated by what his actions have forced you to endure. He never meant for Mr. Harrington to pursue you so aggressively and is beside himself with remorse. Our circumstances have improved somewhat. Your uncle has taken your father into his shipping business. We can repay part of the debt to Mr. Harrington legitimately. Please forgive us and know that you are welcome to return home whenever you wish." Grace read the letter twice, emotions warring within her. Relief that her parents were well mixed with lingering hurt at their willingness to barter her future. Bad news. Reed asked gently, noticing her expression. "Not bad," Grace replied, folding the letter carefully. "Just complicated. My parents want me to return to Boston." Something flickered in Reed's eyes, disappointment perhaps, before his expression returned to careful neutrality. "Will you go?" The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken implications. Grace realized with sudden clarity that she had no desire to return east. Despite the dangers and difficulties, Wyoming had given her something Boston never had: independence, purpose, and the chance to define herself on her own terms. "No," she said firmly, "my life is here now." Relief softened Reed's features. "I'm glad to hear it." The children would miss their teacher. "Just the children?" Grace asked before she could stop herself. Reed held her gaze, the usual reserve in his eyes giving way to something warmer. "Not just the children," he admitted quietly. The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility, until Mrs. Blackwood called them in for supper, breaking the spell. As summer ripened into early autumn, tensions with Harrington escalated. Despite the pending legal case, He made several attempts to intimidate Grace into returning to Sweetwater. Twice, his men were spotted near Willow Creek Ranch, though they retreated when confronted by Mrs. Blackwood's well-armed ranch hands. Sheriff Reed increased his visits, ostensibly to provide updates on the case, though Grace suspected he was also checking on the ranch's security. Each visit deepened their connection. Grace found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Boston, her dreams of building a school of her own someday. In return, Reed gradually revealed pieces of his past growing up on a small farm in Ohio, losing his parents to fever, drifting west as a young man, and eventually finding his calling as a lawman. "I never planned to stay in one place this long," he confessed during one visit as they walked along the creek that gave the ranch its name. "But Sweetwater got under my skin somehow." "It has a way of doing that," Grace agreed, thinking of how quickly she had come to love this wild, beautiful country. Reed stopped walking, turning to face her. "It's not just the place," he said quietly. "It's the people." Before Grace could respond, a rifle shot cracked the air. Reed reacted instantly, pulling her down behind a boulder as more shots followed. "Harrington's men," he growled, drawing his revolver. "Stay down." Heart pounding, Grace pressed herself against the cold stone as Reed fired back at their unseen attackers. Shouts echoed across the valley, and she realized Mrs. Blackwood's ranch hands were responding to the gunfire. "We need to move," Reed said urgently. "The creek bed will give us cover back to the ranch house." Taking her hand, he led her into the shallow water, both of them crouching low as they made their way along the creek. The cold water soaked Grace's boots and the hem of her skirt, but fear overrode any discomfort. Behind them, the exchange of gunfire continued. When they reached the ranch yard, several hands were positioned defensively around the buildings. Mrs. Blackwood herself stood on the porch with a shotgun. "The children?" Grace gasped as Reed pulled her toward the house. "Safe in the root cellar," Mrs. Blackwood assured her. "How many are there, Sam?" "At least 6 that I could see," Reed replied grimly. "They were waiting to catch us alone." "Cowards," Mrs. Blackwood spat, firing on an unarmed woman. For the next hour, a tense standoff ensued. Harrington's men, realizing they were now outgunned and outmaneuvered, eventually withdrew, but not before shouting threats that they would return with more men. That evening, after ensuring the ranch was secure, Reed found Grace on the front porch. She had changed into dry clothes, but she couldn't stop trembling, a delayed reaction to the danger. "You should return to Sweetwater," she said when he joined her. "They're after me, not you. I don't want anyone else hurt because of my troubles." Reed's expression was resolute. "I'm not leaving you unprotected. Mrs. Blackwood and her men are capable," Reed finished, "but Harrington is escalating. Today was just a warning. Next time he won't miss." Grace wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the mild evening. "What would you have me do?" "Surrender myself to him?" "Never," Reed said fiercely, stepping closer. "We'll face the court date in 3 days. The judge will invalidate that supposed contract, and Harrington will have no legal claim on you. And if he doesn't care about legality." Reed's hand came up to touch her cheek gently. "Then I'll still protect you, whatever it takes." The tenderness in his touch broke something loose in Grace, the fear, the tension, the uncertainty of the past weeks. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and Reed drew her into his arms, holding her as she sobbed against his chest. "I'm sorry," she managed when the storm of emotion had passed. Embarrassed by her breakdown, Reed's arms remained around her, solid and reassuring. "Don't be. You've been braver than anyone has a right to expect." Grace looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they stood, of the steady beat of his heart beneath her hand. "Samuel," she whispered, using his given name for the first time. He lowered his head slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished. But Grace rose on her toes to meet him, her eyes closing as their lips met in a gentle kiss that quickly deepened with shared longing. When they finally parted, Reed rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since I pulled you away from that wagon," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Grace smiled, a warm happiness displacing the fear that had gripped her earlier. "I'm glad you did, both the pulling and the kissing." The court date arrived with tension hanging over Willow Creek Ranch like storm clouds. Sheriff Reed had arranged for a deputy, and several trusted townsmen to escort Grace to Sweetwater, where the territorial circuit judge would hear the case. The small courthouse was packed with curious onlookers when Grace entered. Harrington sat at the plaintiff's table, a distinguished-looking lawyer at his side. He was older than Grace had expected, perhaps in his 50s, with cold eyes and an imperious bearing that suggested a man accustomed to getting his way. The proceedings began with Harrington's lawyer presenting the signed agreement between Nichols and his client. The judge, a thin, scholarly man named Parker, examined the document carefully. "This purports to transfer ownership of a human being in exchange for debt forgiveness," Judge Parker said, his tone neutral. "Mr. Wheeler, are you aware that such contracts have been constitutionally invalid since 1865? Harrington's lawyer cleared his throat. "Your Honor, this is not a contract of slavery but a marriage arrangement. Such arrangements with financial considerations have long been customary." "Against the will of the woman involved?" the judge asked pointedly. "The arrangement was made with her legal guardian," Wheeler countered. At this point, Grace's lawyer, Mr. Duncan from Cheyenne, rose. "Your Honor, Miss Nichols was of legal age when this supposed arrangement was made. She was 22 years old and no longer under her father's guardianship in the eyes of the law." The argument continued, with both lawyers presenting their cases. Throughout, Grace sat straight-backed beside Mr. Duncan, aware of Harrington's occasional glares and Sheriff Reed's reassuring presence just behind her. Finally, Judge Parker raised his hand for silence. "I've heard enough. This document, regardless of how it is characterized, attempts to compel a free adult woman into an arrangement she does not consent to. As such, it violates both the letter and the spirit of our laws. I declare it null and void." Relief washed over Grace like a cool mountain stream. Behind her, she heard Reed exhale slowly. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "I find Mr. Harrington's pursuit of Miss Nichols, including the recent armed assault at Willow Creek Ranch, to constitute criminal harassment. Mr. Harrington, you will cease all attempts to contact or coerce Miss Nichols. Should you violate this order, you will face imprisonment. Do I make myself clear?" Harrington's face had darkened with anger, but he nodded stiffly. "Yes, Your Honor." As the court adjourned, people began to file out. Grace turned to thank Mr. Duncan and found Sheriff Reed at her side, his expression watchful as Harrington approached them. "This isn't over, Reed," Harrington said in a low voice. "You've made an enemy today." "Add it to the list," Reed replied calmly. "But understand this, if you or your men come near Miss Nichols again, it'll be the last mistake you make." Harrington's eyes shifted to Grace. "You're not worth the trouble anyway," he sneered before stalking away. Outside the courthouse, sunshine bathed the street in golden light. For the first time since arriving in Wyoming, Grace felt truly free. The legal shadow that had hung over her was gone, and with it, the last ties to her old life. "What will you do now?" Reed asked as they walked toward his office. "Mrs. Blackwood has asked me to stay on as the ranch's teacher," Grace replied. "I'm inclined to accept, at least for now." Reed nodded, a hint of disappointment crossing his features. "It's a good position. The children are lucky to have you." Grace stopped walking, turning to face him. "But I'd be 20 miles from Sweetwater." "A considerable distance," Reed agreed cautiously. "Too far, I think," Grace said softly. "Especially if I wanted to see a certain sheriff regularly." Hope brightened Reed's blue eyes. "Is that something you might want?" Grace smiled, suddenly certain of her path forward. "Very much so. In fact, I've been thinking of opening a proper school here in Sweetwater. The town is growing and children need education." "The town council has been discussing that very need," Reed said, taking her hand in his. "They might be persuaded to provide a building, especially for a teacher as qualified as yourself." "And where would this teacher live?" Grace asked, her heart quickening at the warmth of his touch. Reed's thumb traced patterns on her palm. "Well, as it happens, I have a house that's too big for just one person. It has a nice garden plot and plenty of room for, say, a family to grow." "Samuel Reed, are you proposing something?" Grace asked, her voice catching. He stepped closer, his free hand coming up to cup her cheek. "I'm proposing everything, Grace. A life together, if you'll have me." I know it's sudden. Grace silenced him with a kiss, heedless of the townsfolk who might see them. When they parted, she was smiling through tears of joy. It doesn't feel sudden at all. It feels like coming home. 6 months later, on a perfect spring day, Grace Nichols became Grace Reed in a ceremony at Willow Creek Ranch. Mrs. Blackwood hosted the celebration, the ranch children scattered flower petals along the aisle, and the entire population of Sweetwater seemed to attend. As they exchanged vows beneath an arch of wildflowers, Grace reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a frightened woman being forced into a wagon to a bride freely choosing her future, the path had been unexpected but perfect in its own way. "I do," she said clearly when the time came, her eyes locked with Samuel's. "I do," he echoed, his voice steady and sure. Later, as they danced under lantern light with friends and well-wishers around them, Samuel pulled her close. "Any regrets about staying in Wyoming?" he asked. Grace shook her head, her heart full. "None. This is exactly where I'm meant to be. With me," he asked, a rare vulnerability in his eyes. "With you," she confirmed. "Always." As the stars emerged above the Wyoming plains, Grace knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the arms of the man who had pulled her back from the brink of despair and into a life of love and possibility.